It was 1957, my first job. I was on the links caddying, and I was blessed this particular day with 2 bags and 2 beautiful young women that I was caddying for. And as we made the rounds, around the 6th hole, as I recall, one of the women bent over and she reached into the hole, and at that moment, something strange happened. Hormones kicked in that I didn't know existed. And there were #adulthood all over me. I was so embarrassed. Moreover, I didn't know what was happening. I was very naive at that time because in those days, we didn't learn about the bees and the birds and the birds and the bees, which young 4-year-olds can tell you about today. So I don't know whether that was a metaphor or a morphosis of things to come. A number of years later, I believe it was 1960, my first day in the Navy, I was flying to Chicago to the Great Lakes with about 30 other guys who had signed up that day. And our plane was scheduled to leave at 4 p.m. Well, midnight came, and we were still waiting because there was mechanical trouble. Needless to say, I had never flown before, and my young adulthood and my lack of experience made me quite nervous. And when they finally decided that we were going to take off, I had about 6.5 hours to worry about the mechanical problems. And as we took off towards Chicago, we began hitting all these headwinds. And I'd never flown before, and we started dropping 200 and 300 feet. And I had a load somewhere that I don't want to describe, but it was another metamorphosis, if you know what I mean. And years later, I remember seeing the Pope come to the States, and the first thing he did was he bent over and kissed the ground. And I knew retrospectively exactly why he did that. Then, about 2 years later, I was promoted in the Navy to Petty Officer 3rd Class. I was the only one of 7 who was promoted, and now I was the boss. And all my buddies didn't like it. They were not very kind and considerate. And it was a real challenge for me to shape up and become a young adult, because I had gone on shore and been out partying with all these guys, and now I was their boss. So it took me a while, but finally I came to the sense of responsibility and could accept it. But some of them never did. At any rate, the next event that I want to talk about happened in 1974. This particular day, I was so excited. I walked into the admission office at Temple University and I inquired, is it possible that I could find out if I've been accepted to medical school? Because I have an interview in Chicago and I really can't afford to go there because I have a wife and 2 kids and all kinds of debts, and I really can't move. And she said, I'm not allowed to tell you, but she said, I will, you're accepted. And I was in the epitome of happiness. I called my wife and I was so excited. And then I got in the car to drive home and I turned on the radio and Pachelbel's Canon was on. And it was just the most swooning, loving, comprehensive experience of my life. I was so happy, and this music just brought me almost to the position of this man who just spoke about his experience. Well, it wasn't long before I realized that how much I had bitten off and was possibly not able to chew. I had taken the Dale Carnegie course, and one of the principles they taught you was you can do anything. Never be afraid. Always challenge yourself. So I had been a dance teacher. I talked my way into becoming a dance teacher. I didn't know my left foot from my right, but I learned that there are 2 feet. I later became a podiatrist, so I had to know that by then. But I didn't know what I was getting into. The audacity of it all, challenging myself to go to medical school. I was accepted at the end of my junior year. They said I was mature. Yeah, I was 30. And my fellow classmates who were science majors, and I was a non-declared major entering at the end of my junior year from undergraduate school. And they knew everything and I knew nothing. And I was spending about 55 or 60% of my time studying lower extremity anatomy because it was one of the most important courses. And I had 7 other sciences to digest and sift through and try to accomplish. And I found myself woefully unprepared. So much so that one Sunday morning, early, I was lying in bed. My wife was a nurse and she had gone to Lancaster Hospital to the emergency room for her job. And I was so despondent. The radio must have been set for me to get up early, and this minister was talking about God. And I was so despondent that I got down on my hands and knees and I said, "Dear Lord, please lift this burden. Please give me some insight into how I'm going to do this." Well, he did. Life is somewhat inexplicable, but not insurmountable. In 1986, a number of years later, my wife and I and kids were traveling to our semi-annual trip to Philadelphia to see my wife's youthful dentist that she had had since she was a kid. And we always made a day out of it and went to our favorite hiking place in Valley Green. Well, I had passed this 18-wheeler some 2 miles prior to coming to a cattle chute. And I had to hit my brakes pretty rapidly to slow down and stop. And I looked in the mirror because I knew he was behind me, and I thought, is he going to have time? And then, boom, my whole life went before me in a matter of milliseconds. First was thrust forward and then backward. And I had looked in the mirror and I saw him. And I thought, is he going to have time to stop? And that's when it hit. And I watched in this microcosm of time as this car immediately in front of us came at me. And then it began to go vertical. And then it came up on my hood. And then it leaned laterally and stopped against the barrier purchased there. And my kids were screaming, and I turned around, and one daughter had a single piece of glass in her head, and the other had a bad headache. And my wife and I had tremendous whiplash injuries that, to this day, we have arthritis in our necks because of it. But that was a small price to pay. We kicked on the doors, and people pulled on them, and they opened in this old Mercedes-Benz I had, and I decided we better get out. And I reached to take my keys, and I recognized that the engine was still running. Mercedes had done everything they possibly could with that car, and the engine was pushed up almost to the hood, the diesel engine, and it was still running. So I took my keys and we got out. There was nothing left of the front and the back of my car. It was a shell. My kids and wife were ushered to a trailer somewhat behind. And a man came up to me and he said, "My goodness," he said, "did anybody survive this?" I said, "Yeah, we all did." And then after hospitalization and being checked out, we were released. And then the fun began. When I say fun, the tragedy of it all. I would look at my kids for a long time, months and months, and I would just cry It was like going through an earthen storm, going through a meteor, going through an avalanche, all combined into one. And so I began to dwell on my friend Leon Smith, who had introduced me to a job I had right before I went to medical school. I was a salesman for Maidenform Incorporated out of New York. He and I were on the same ship together. This particular day that he described to me, he was a radarman and went to chow, went down to his berthing compartment. A bunch of his buddies were playing poker. And they wanted him to play, and he said, no, I got to be on watch at 2000, and I'm going to just relax. So he laid down, and a voice said to him, Leon, go on up to the radar room right now. So he said, Chet, I listened to this voice, and I went up to the radar room, and within seconds after these guys were teasing him, what the hell are you doing up here? A kamikaze aircraft came down, hit the side of the ship, obliterated his berthing compartment, killed every one of his buddies. Now, I never questioned him on that story when he told it to me, and we were good friends. He was my boss at that point. And after the accident, I began to dwell on it almost daily. And then I began to think, was it the same angel who whispered in his ears, the same one that came by in an angelic-like way and lifted that automobile directly from in front of us onto the side barrier, so that, as my late father-in-law's analysis as an engineer said, we had a gap to allow that energy to dissipate, and that's why we survived. And so, shortly after that, I began to become a little more spiritual and recognize that I had a purpose for living. And one last thing I want to say, even though I'm running over, because it's the most profoundest thing to me, even to this day, a poem by Rabindranath Tagore that describes how I feel. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptieth again and again, and filleth it with ever fresh life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. My infinite gifts come to me only on these very little hands of mine. Ages pass, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. And that's my best adulting perspective.